everyone, my name is Sarah Townley. I'm a Youth Program Associate with the University of Missouri Extension. And today I wanted to teach you guys a little bit about a subject that I personally am pretty passionate about that also happens to be a 4-H project. So whenever I was a 4-H member, I was in photography for one of my projects. I also did quite a bit of it in college and I still do it to this day as a hobby. So I'm pretty excited to share a little bit about photography with all of you. And I've intended for this lesson to be beneficial for everyone, no matter their experience level, from those of you who maybe just started in photography 1 with 4-H, or maybe you have a little bit of experience. Hopefully there's something beneficial in it for all of you. So really quickly, some of the things that you should be able to do by the end of this lesson are identify the parts of a DSLR camera, explain the rule of thirds, explain photo composition, and then this last objective is for some of you who are a little bit more advanced and have experience in photography. You should be able to operate a camera in manual mode using ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So the first thing we'll go over is the parts of a DSLR camera. So you do not have to have a fancy camera to take photos and exhibit your projects in 4-H. You can, if you don't have access to a camera and you just have a smartphone or maybe you have a little digital camera, that's okay. Hopefully some of the principles that we'll learn further on in this lesson will help you out no matter what you're taking pictures on. But I would highly recommend, if you don't have a DSLR camera, or if your mom or dad doesn't have one, see if you can borrow one from someone, like maybe your photography project leader in 4-H, or check one out from somewhere. Some county extension offices do have photo and video equipment that are available for checkout. So if you can, try to get a DSLR camera to go and learn and kind of play around with. So this, and I should quickly mention that in the professional photography world, there seems to be kind of a debate between the two major factions, which are Nikon people and Canon people. So as you probably noticed, this picture in the cover and then this picture right here are both Nikons, and then I took this straight from Nikon's website. I'm a little bit partial to Nikons. I have a Nikon D7200, which is a newer model than this camera right here, but a lot of features still look the same. And like I said, I took this from Nikon's website. And I've actually, if you're taking this lesson with me, I've provided the content to you, but you can just go out, Google parts of a Nikon camera, and you should be able to find this on their website along with the legend, the code that goes along with these numbers. So the part, I'm not going to go through every single one of these parts with you, but I'm going to show you some of the parts that are pretty much standard on every camera and the ones that are going to be important for you to know. So first of all, that one that is labeled as number 2 is the power switch. Pretty simple, that turns your camera on and off, but it's important to know. The one that is a little switch labeled as number 1, going backwards here a little bit, is the shutter release button. And so that has a feature that is what we would call a soft or a hard press. And so if you soft press that shutter release button, which is basically you push it but not all the way down, if your camera is in autofocus mode, which most likely it will be because manual focus is kind of an advanced feature, then soft pressing that button will focus the camera on your subject for you. And then of course, hard pressing that button will snap your picture. The next one, which is labeled as number 7, I thought I would quickly mention, is the movie record button. Since this is a lesson on photography and not videography, this isn't really that important to know, but a lot of the things that you learn, the principles that you learn about photography will help you if you do go on to do any videography whatsoever. So this next one, that's labeled number 8, is the mode dial. Of course, this one's kind of self-explanatory. This lets you choose which camera mode that you want to shoot, and then different cameras have different modes, like some of them have an outdoor mode or an action mode. I personally pretty much only use the mode dial to switch between manual and auto. This next one that's labeled number 10, it's kind of hard to see what it is because it's not engaged right now, but some of you may know that this is the camera flash. It's labeled on the website as the built-in flash, but within the professional photography industry, a lot of people will refer to this as the onboard flash. So that pops up and that's where your flash comes from. But a lot of the time it's hidden and folded down like it is in this picture. This next one that's labeled number 17 is your lens release button. This is if you want to take off your lens, if you're going to switch it, or if you're just going to take it off and put your camera away. That is how you unlock the mechanism that locks your lens into place and take your camera off. This next one that's labeled number 20 is called your monitor. You might just call this one the screen. This is where you can see the playback from photos that you've taken, or in certain situations, you can use it instead of the viewfinder. Which, speaking of the viewfinder, that's the next one. That's what number 22 is, the viewfinder eyepiece. This next one is the playback button. It has a little play symbol on it. This is what you push if you want to look at and get a preview of the photos you've taken. Next one, this little trash can. That's the delete button. That's probably pretty simple. You knew what that one was. This next one that's on the side, it will look different on different cameras, but a lot of times on the side of the camera, not always, but that's where the door is that you open to insert or remove the SD card. This door on the bottom is the battery chamber cover. This is where you take your battery in and out. Most cameras have rechargeable batteries that you will, of course, have to recharge. Some of them do take other kinds of batteries. Most DSLRs don't, to my knowledge. And then this last one is called the tripod socket. This is if you are using a camera tripod. A lot of them, I'm not too familiar with tripods. Some of them might screw directly into the camera. The one that I have, which it comes from Amazon, is one that has a base. So the base goes into the camera, it screws into the bottom of the camera, and then you clip that base with the camera attached onto the actual tripod itself. So anyway, that part on the bottom of the camera is where the tripod goes if you're using one. So next, this section will be on composition, shots, lighting, etc. And this to me is a good review, even for me, even though I've been taking pictures for probably close to 10 years now, at least 10 years. So hopefully this is a good review for those of you who have a little bit more experience, but these are the things that make a good photo. So first we're going to talk about some of our principles of composition. And the first one is the rule of thirds. This one is kind of the go-to composition principle for all of photography. So first, and some of the examples for some of these different principles I'm going to give you are going to be pictures that I've taken. Some of them are not. This one does happen to be a picture that I took at my county's fair, the county that I am a 4-H staff member in. And so what the rule of thirds is you see that I've taken this picture that I took. The yellow lines are not a part of the picture, but I put them over the picture because the rule of thirds is where you basically take your picture or take in your viewfinder and mentally do this and divide it into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, and make a 3x3 9 square. And so the rule of thirds essentially states, based on science, what we know about where the eye goes when we look at a picture, that you should aim to either put the subject of your picture on the intersection of one of those points or along the lines. And so as you can see with this picture right here, the boy showing his pig at the fair, not only did I put the boy himself, the exhibitor, on that right 1/3 vertical line, but his pig also falls on that bottom horizontal 1/3 line. This is true for photos of any orientation. This one is a girl named Katie also showing at the fair. You can see that Katie's body is along that right 1/3 line. Her face also falls kind of, at least the bottom of her face falls on that intersection up there at the top. And then her sheep's face, her lamb's face also falls along that bottom 1/3 line. Here's another example. These are two boys dancing at camp. Their bodies kind of fall each on the 1/3 lines, and then their hands just so happen to fall. I didn't plan that when they were dancing to the YMCA, but their hands happened to fall on the intersections, both of them. And so that made it a good picture. Because sometimes it is a little bit hard to keep these in mind, keep some of these composition principles in mind while you're taking pictures of, say, like action things going on, like sports events or dances or nature, like birds flying, deer running, so on and so forth. This is actually a picture that my sister took of me. And you'll notice that this picture is different than the orientation I usually have my other, or the size that I have my pictures at. I usually try to crop them at like a 5:7 ratio. This one's at a square, but you can see that my horse and I are still on the 1/3, and kind of the concentration of the subjects of the picture is on the bottom 1/3, and the top, we'll talk a little bit about negative space later, but keep that in mind because this picture is a good use of negative space up there at the top. This, really quickly, I figured I should mention that, of course, even though the rule of thirds is a good guideline for us to use whenever we're trying to shoot good pictures and come up with good pictures, every rule has an exception. And so there are exceptions to the rule of third. You're not bound, if you take a picture, just because it doesn't follow the rule of thirds means it's a bad picture. So for example, this one right here was a picture I took at our county fair of some cattle in the show at the lineup. And with a lot of these pictures, it is difficult to necessarily get them on the 1/3 because the lines that the cattle and the exhibitors form are diagonal and don't fall in the 1/3. They kind of cross the picture, or it's like this where the cattle are on one side of the picture and the judge and a ringman are on the left side of the picture. But this is just a picture that I got, and it's definitely not my best work of art, but it is one that I took to record some of the events that were happening at our county fair. And so this is an example of one, and we'll see more, that don't follow the rule of thirds. So our next principle of composition is symmetry. Now, just how we talked about the rule of thirds, this one is where that rule kind of tends to go down the toilet most of the time, because with symmetry doesn't mean your entire photo has to be symmetrical. It can mean aspects of your photo, but ones like these, the beauty in this picture is, first of all, symmetry, and second of all, lines, which is another principle of composition that we'll talk about next. So this one doesn't really follow the rule of thirds, but it's still an excellent picture because there are things for your eye to follow, and it has a lot of good composition to it, both symmetry and, like I said, lines. Here's another one. Oh, and I guess I should mention that this photo is not mine. It's a stock photo from the internet, and so is this one. This one's not perfectly symmetrical, but it does have aspects of symmetry to it, and it doesn't really follow the rule of thirds, in my opinion. This photo is also from the internet. This one, again, symmetry as well as lines. I guess you could argue that this one follows the rule of thirds because that brown portion at the top kind of falls along within that top third portion, but symmetry is probably the overwhelming principle of composition for this photo. So I've already mentioned lines. You can also hear these referred to as leading lines, and basically we talked a little bit about with the rule of thirds. There's science behind where the eye is drawn to whenever a person looks at a photo. And so with lines, good lines within and throughout a photo give our eyes something to follow and helps give the photo flow, if that makes sense. So I'll show you some examples. This one is kind of a dramatic example. A photo doesn't necessarily have to have like super dramatic lines like this to have good leading lines. You can have something like a photo of a road, maybe winding around in the road through some hills kind of leads your eyes through the photo. That's an example that's less dramatic, but this one right here, not only do those series of lines that are shaped like a V in the structure provide some interesting lines and somewhere for your eyes to go, but those straight lines of the pathway leading back to where the man is standing give you some lines for your eyes to follow. Here's another one. This also has some principles of symmetry in it as well, but some lines that make the photo interesting to look at. And this is one that I took. And this is, again, not necessarily my best work of art, or my best photo artistically, but you can kind of see on the side that sometimes fences, especially if you're into farm photography or livestock photography, or even fences, like say in a neighborhood, fences are some of the best examples and well-loved photo subjects or parts of a photo that give us leading lines. So you can kind of see the lines along the right side, give us something to look at and give us something for our eye to follow. So another element of composition is called depth of field, and we'll talk about shallow depth of field as well as large or deep depth of field. This first one is a photo that I took, same horse show as the last picture, And this one is extremely shallow depth of field because we are focused in on something very fine and very close to the camera. This is one of my personal favorites. The camera focused in on the dirt that was flying from the rider. And then I guess secondarily, the focus is on the horse, and then the background behind the horse is pretty much non-existent. You can't see it at all because we are focused, we have such a shallow depth of field, but we're focused on something so close up to the camera. This one has, I would say, a shallow to medium depth of field because we're focused on the rider, Michaela, and her horse, and then also some of the dirt that her horse is throwing up as she's asked it to stop. And then you've heard of background, but we also refer to this when we have a shallower depth of field, the subject that's in the foreground is what it's called. We have background and we have foreground. So when the depth of field is more shallow, we have a very distinct background and foreground. But whenever a depth of field is larger, then there's not quite as distinct of a line or a focus, I guess you could say, between shallow or large depth of field. So this is not my photo. This is another stock photo from the internet. You notice there's really nothing close to the camera that's in focus. There's no clear background and foreground. Everything's kind of in focus pretty equally. This is a very large or a very wide depth of field. Same thing with this one. This is another photo I pulled from the internet, stock photo. This one, now I'm going to quiz you a little bit. I noticed at least two other well-used elements of composition in this photo. Can you think of what they are? Personally, I would say that this photo uses symmetry and the rule of thirds. I would argue that the shoreline down there is on that bottom 1/3, and so that gives us a little bit of that rule of thirds. And then the symmetry between the color, the clouds, and all the color that we see in the sky is reflected in the water. And so there are a lot of elements that make this photo really beautiful, and they're all used very well together, and they don't overpower one another. Because remember, sometimes less is more. So another element or principle of composition is framing. Now you'll notice that, and this is not my photo, when we talk about framing, we mean that you can use other elements within a photo, even if it's not your subject, to kind of, I guess, give your photo a certain feel or send a certain message. For example, the subject of this photo is the woman. And she, even though she is in focus, she's framed by this sculpture or whatever it is, it's very out of focus, that is around her. She's framed by that. Now this is a photo that I took, same horse show that I've showed you a couple pictures of before. These are a couple of boys that had been showing. They're not, of course, riding in whatever class is going on right now. And I took a picture of them from behind the fence. And even though they are in focus and they are my subjects, they are framed by the fence because I was standing behind the fence. So you can frame your subject with something and make it look really neat. So we talked a little bit, I mentioned briefly negative space. So what negative space is essentially a space that is not busy or that doesn't have a lot going on. It doesn't have a subject. And so one example, I'll give you two examples of ways that you can use negative space. Now this is going to be the more common one unless you have a certain intention with a photo or you have more advanced skills. The use of negative space here is that there's not really a lot going on other than your one subject, which is this lone and bare tree. The sky doesn't have a lot going on, even though it's beautiful and there's a sunset. There's not much in the background on the left there as far as the trees of the mountains go. And then that grass hill, there's not a lot going on there. It's just grass. Our focus is pretty much only on that tree, which kind of sends a message and gives a certain feeling to this photo. So the next way that you can use negative space is by just blatantly, I guess you could say, not using it at all and filling up your entire frame. But I will warn you, there is a fine line between overwhelming what should be your subject and using this lack of negative space artistically. So for example, there's no negative space in this photo because the leaves fill up the frame. And the artist that took this photo, and this is a stock photo I found on the internet, as is the last one. their intention was to capture the detail and the beauty of the fall leaves. And so they filled up the frame with the leaves. Now, another super dramatic example of a way that you can have a photo subject not use negative space and also not overpower them is like this one, also pulled off the internet from a stock website. It's a photo of a cat up close. There's no background, no negative space. It's all cat, but the frame is filled up with the cat's fur, which almost in a way acts as a negative space because your focus is on the detail of the face and the eyes and those big whiskers and the nose. But this is a good way that you can use a lack of negative space. So either way, a careful use of negative space is necessary, whether that's a lot of negative space to make a statement like this one, or very little to none. So we've talked about principles of composition. Next, we'll talk a little bit about lighting. So there's quite a bit to talk about and think about when it comes to lighting. So there's the quality of the lighting, which I'll give you an example on the next slide of the time of day, hard light, soft light, backlighting. Quantity of lighting, that one's a pretty simple one to understand how much light is there, because too much light or too little light can sometimes pose a problem. The direction of the lighting. Essentially, with the direction of the lighting, you have to be kind of intentional about how it makes your subject look. So for example, and again, I'll show you backlighting on the next slide, you have to be careful if your main light source is behind your subject, because now if your goal is to kind of do more of a silhouette walking into the sunshine, sunset kind of look, or if you want them to be a little bit more faded or dark, then you can use backlighting. But if your intention is for your subject to have a lot of detail, and if you want them to really be the star of the show and you want to be able to see like their eyes or have a lot of saturation or contrast to them, the subject, then you're probably not going to want to use backlighting quite as much as having your subject face the lighting, which means the light would be behind you, or to kind of get it from the side. So as far as color of lighting, what may come to your mind when you think of color of lighting is like experimenting with different colors of light, like green or blue or pink or fun things like that. And it can mean that, but usually when we talk about color of lighting, we're talking about cool versus warm light. We're talking about more of like a yellow light versus a blue light, or when we talk about white light, that's usually kind of a pretty harsh light. And we'll talk about hardness of light as well. That's a quality of lighting, but I'll explain that. Well, here in a couple of slides, I'll give you an example of colors of lighting. So this one is when we talk about quality of lighting. You've probably heard of the term golden hour. And so what that means in a photography world is that ideally when it comes to natural light, like taking pictures outside, the ideal time to be outside taking pictures is during the evening, like before sunset. During the summertime, I usually like to start my photo shoots around 5 o'clock, maybe a little earlier, just to make sure we get some good pictures in. But around 5 or 6 in the summertime is whenever the lighting really starts to look good. And so you can see that in this picture in the middle. And in order to find a good example, I pulled this off the photographer's website. The link is down there to give them credit. But that picture in the middle was taken during golden hour. The picture on the left is what happens if you take pictures in the middle of the day. Generally in the middle of the day, the sun is right overhead. It's very bright. You probably notice, like, especially during the summertime, that's whenever the portion of the day is hottest. The sun is really bearing down and it's at an angle. We talked a little bit about direction of lighting. The quality of lighting is just not ideal for photos because you can kind of see what I mean when I say hard versus soft light. That picture on the left, she's very washed out. Her whole face looks very white. There's not much detail or dimension or even expression to her face, in my opinion. So you can kind of tell the difference between the left and the middle photos. One was taken during golden hour, the one in the middle. The one on the right has an element of backlight to it. And so it's not dramatic enough that she is a silhouette and the sunshine is bright behind her. But you can kind of see how she looks a little bit more faded. The color is less saturated and you can kind of see the glow coming from behind her. That is an example of quality of light as well as direction. So I also wanted to mention when we talk about color of light, sometimes, and also quantity, we talked a little bit about onboard flash on your camera. And so you may have noticed that when you use your onboard flash, you get results like that Winnie the Pooh bear on the top. And so again, in order to get this example, I had to pull this from a photographer's website. It's linked below, or the URL is down there to give her credit. This photographer specifically took this picture to talk about lighting sources. And so you may have noticed that if you ever watched a photographer take pictures of the backdrop, think about maybe your school picture day. Those photographers have their camera and then a backdrop that you sit in front of, and then they have big lights with things that look like umbrellas on them. The reason they have those is because they want to A, soften the light, and B, diffuse the light. So what you notice about that picture up above is Pooh Bear is washed out, the light is very bright, it makes him look very white, and it kind of removes the detail from him as a subject. You'll also notice that he is the only thing in that picture that's getting any light. The background behind him is very dark and he's very light, and there's too much contrast. He's absorbing too much of that light because that onboard lighting, the pop-up lighting we talked about, is not diffused very well. It's focused all on him, and it's not softened very well either. So at the bottom, what I believe the photographer did was use an external lighting kit, which we talked about the ones that photographers use with the big stands that look like umbrellas. There's also ones that you can attach to your camera. You may be thinking of like a news reporter with the things on top of their cameras that you can adjust up or down. And you'll also notice like a milky white plastic cover that you can put on it that diffuses the light, or it kind of disperses it so it's not all focused in one place, and it also softens it. So you can also notice in the background on the bottom, not only is Pooh Bear looking a little bit more expressive and colorful, and he's not quite so washed out, the background behind him also is not very dark. There's not that super hyper contrast that kind of makes that picture up above look unprofessional. So that's an example of, and again, all of these different principles of lighting kind of work together. So it's an example of quantity and quality and color and direction of lighting. So lastly, and here's the chapter that we get to for those of you who are a little bit more experienced, we're going to talk about shooting manually. I do want to take a quick minute to say that there's no shame in shooting in auto. A lot of people do it. For example, I shoot video most of the time in auto mode because video is a lot harder to adjust just by nature than photography is. But also personally, whenever I'm shooting event photography, things like weddings, where you have to capture certain moments and you need to get that shot when it's going on. You don't have time to mess with your camera settings. Sometimes if your settings are not working the way you want to, you just have to turn it on auto and go in certain situations. So I do want to say really quickly, there's no shame in shooting in auto, but learning to shoot in manual mode will help give you some creative freedom and help you fine tune your skills as an artist. So there's a lot to it, but the 3 settings that I'm going to teach you about today that you're going to want to know and kind of work with when you're learning to shoot in manual are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And these all 3 work together because you'll have to adjust them all with each other because different shots require different things. So you'll kind of want to take a day and go out and kind of mess with these and see what you get, what different shots you get with the different settings. So first of all, ISO essentially by definition is light sensitivity. Higher ISO means your camera is more sensitive to light and it picks up more light, lets more light in. And a lower ISO is going to let less light in. But when you increase the ISO, you'll also increase the graininess that comes in your final photo. So aperture is what you might know as f-stop, and that is the focus control. So a higher aperture is going to put more in focus. We talked about depth of field. If you have the f-stop number turned up higher, then it is going to put less in focus, for example, like the landscape photo that I showed you, versus if you decrease your f-stop, it's going to focus on more on what is closest to the camera or what you have in focus. It's going to put whatever subject is in focus more in focus. So the shutter speed is pretty self-explanatory. The higher the shutter speed is, that's basically how fast the shutter is moving. Whenever you click the camera button, how fast it's taking that picture. And basically, if your shutter is open for longer, it's going to let more light in. So all of that is a little bit confusing whenever you're first learning about it, but this chart, which I will attach if you are, if you're taking this course with me, I'll give it to you, but this is the simplest way to explain what each of them do. And so thank you for watching. For more information on photography with 4-H, contact your local university extension office. Again, if you're taking this course with me, I've also provided you with a journaling form. So that's your homework. You can go out and take a picture and practice with those different principles of composition, some of the things we talked about, and then you can write about them after you take the photo. So you'll take a photo and you'll write, these are the elements of composition I used, this is where my photo was taken, and so on and so forth. So again, thank you for watching. I hope you learned some new things that will help you out as an artist.